Thank you, Jeff, and welcome everyone to Starting Off the School Year Right. Today, during the webinar, our goal is going to be focusing on making sure everything started off correctly in your school year with reading mastery. So we're going to focus in on placement test and why we have placement tests and the procedures to give the placement test. We'll then talk a little bit about a flow chart to help you further place students that may be in between some of the placement test guidelines that you've seen so far. We'll take a look at how you can group students as well as use that end of the year data for placement. But before we begin, I know you're just starting your school year off, your kids are excited, they're excited about the new school year, so I want to share with you one of my favorite Dr. Seuss quotes. You're off to great places, today is your day, your mountain is waiting, so get on your way. I know you're ready to start this school year and have a very successful implementation with reading mastery. One thing that we can guarantee is every student can learn to read. And one of the things that we believe in is that every student is able to do this because of the placement test. The placement test really provides you information for students, but it also allows you to place them appropriately at their instructional level. The level's not too easy and it's not too hard. It's at the right amount of challenge for students. It is critical, the placement test, for student success, but also for teacher success. A good implementation has all students placed appropriately so every student can fly. So it's really important because if students are improperly placed, you may see one of two things. They get bored, they're not paying attention, or you may see behavior issues arise. So it's really critical for student success, proper placement. Besides giving them their instructional level, at the earlier levels of reading mastery, it actually can determine acceleration for students who can move a little bit faster. So the placement tests are critical for success for students and success for the implementation. We want to start off early with our first poll. So Jeff, could you launch our first poll for everyone?
Here we go. Polls are open. The first question of the year is, should students take the placement test at the beginning of each school year? Yes or no? Should students take the placement test at the beginning of each school year? Just click your answer, whatever you think is the right answer. Go ahead and put it in there. We have 71% voting. Please go ahead and keep going. Should students take the placement test at the beginning of each school year? Looks like this is a good question because we got a good response. We'll give another couple seconds. Impressive. Everyone's responding. Thank you so much. There's a couple holdouts out there, but we'll let you go. And we're going to share the results with you so you can see. We see that right now we have 56% say yes and 44% say no. Kia, back to you.
Almost a split group. So one of the things we want to be sure of is placement tests should only be given to students who are new to reading mastery, new to your school, or incoming kindergartners. So placement tests should not be given to every student every year. They really should only be taking the placement test one time. And that one time is the very first time they enter into reading mastery. Everything else we let mastery tests and all of the data from their program drive where they move to next. Now, placement tests can be found in a variety of ways. So before you give the placement test, you want to make sure that you have opportunity to download them, print them out, make copies, and you can find them in several places. The first place you can look is your teacher's guide in your teacher materials. At every level, it's located in there, or if you've already had initial training, it's in the series guide that you received during the training. But you also can find them online where you can download them, print them, and then make copies at mheonline.com/direct instruction. I encourage you to go there. There's lots of things on there besides the placement test. So once you've done that, you've found the placement test, now you're actually ready to begin placement testing for your students. I want to share some helpful tips that I've heard along the way that I've used in the past. It's really important that anyone that's going to give the placement test to your students has actually been trained on how to give the test. Because there are some things that are very specific to different levels, so you want a person in your building that's been trained on the placement test. You do want to allot about 5 to 10 minutes per student. So if you're testing a large group of kids, you want to make sure you have set aside that amount of minutes for the placement test, because it is approximately 5 to 10 minutes per student. And give it as soon as you can. I know the school year is starting, but you want to give it as soon as possible so that way you can begin grouping your students, but then you also can begin making sure that your students are in the right place, the right teacher, and making sure the implementation gets started smoothly. All the materials should be set up in a separate room if possible. That way you're not disturbing a class of students who may be working or actually distracting the student who's taking the placement test. And this last one is really important. Once those tests have been given, get those results quickly, gather them up, organize them, so that way you can begin sorting by groups and start their groups very quickly. So those are some helpful tips to get started for a placement test. We're going to now take a look at how do I give a placement test for students. We're going to begin with level K because level K is very unique. It's different than the rest of the levels, and then we'll move on to the other levels of reading mastery. One of the very first things you want to do is make copies of your test scoring sheet, which can be found in your teacher's guide. And you want to read the instructions because there are two parts to the level K placement test. You're going to administer the placement test aloud to students, and as the students are answering your questions, you're going to make sure that you're telling on that score sheet. That is critical so that way you can make sure that you are using the guidelines to place students appropriately. Let's take a look at part 1. So here's an example from part 1, and on the side I let you see the scoring sheet. You're going to have them side by side. You want to make sure that you have a scoring sheet for every student that's going to take the level K placement test. And just like when you're teaching the program, there are some instructions on the page for you. So if it's parentheses, it's going to tell you what to do. And here it's telling you to make sure you're circling a point for every correct response. You're also going to have some information that does not have parentheses, and this is going to be for your information. No need to read this to the students. And then the blue writing is going to be what you say to the students, just like if you were teaching a lesson. One thing to keep in mind, though, in the part 1 especially, is that in some of the test items, like in test item D, there are multiple answers. So for this particular test item, students are going to respond to all of the sounds that are listed there vertically. So there really is 5 points that could be possible for item D. And that's reflected also in the scoring sheet. So you want to make sure that you're giving a point for every step of the way on that step D. Once your students have finished part 1, you're going to go ahead and score it right away. And you're going to use the placement test guidelines at the bottom of your scoring sheet to decide where students could be placed. Now, for some students, they'll be finished the placement test. They won't have to move any further. But for other students, they may have to move to another part of the placement test. In the example that you see here, this student will begin at Reading Mastery, Grade K, Lesson 11. But for those students who had almost a perfect score, meaning 19 or 20 out of part 1, they would then move to part 2. When you're giving part 2, you're going to start all over with scoring points. You're going to use just the part 2 of your scoring sheet. And again, at the very end of part 2, use the guidelines at the bottom of the page to place students. Here, it will let you know whether students will be a Reading Mastery Grade K, Lesson 11, or if they're a candidate for that acceleration that we mentioned earlier in the webinar. So that's really the overall procedures for level K. It is much different than the rest of the levels, so it's important to make sure that you have that scoring sheet already ready and reading those instructions prior to giving it to students. Now, the procedures for placement test levels 1 through 5 are a little bit different, but you're going to use very similar procedures. You are going to have copies of a reading passage. This time, those students are going to be timed, so you're still going to have directions read to them. You're still going to administer one-on-one. It's still going to take 5 to 10 minutes, but you're going to time students until they complete the reading, so timing them for the entire time they're reading. You're going to tally errors as well as use the placement test guidelines that are given because each level has a little bit different guidelines for time and for errors. So really make sure you're reading those instructions ahead of time. But before we go into a little bit further detail about how to give the procedure for the placement test for levels 1 through 5, I want us to launch one more poll because this is a very popular questions about what is considered errors on those placement tests. So Jeff, could you launch our second poll for us?
Here you go. Second poll has been launched. This is a little bit more complicated, so you think a little bit. What is considered an error on a Reading Mastery Signature Edition placement test for levels 1 through 5? Select all the correct answers. So it's more than one answer. Could be 2, could be 3, could be 4, could be 5. Just pick the ones you think are errors. Go ahead and take a shot. Thank you very much. I see some people voting. Even if you're not sure, go ahead and put the ones you think are the answers, because I'll give you a hint, it's more than one. Wait a few more seconds. I know Kia's got a lot to talk about. And we'll go ahead and close the poll down, and let's see what the answers are. Kia, hold on one second.
Okay.
There are the answer. There are the responses we had. Misreading a word, doesn't identify a word in 10 seconds, reading a word self-correcting, skipping words or skipping a line, and sounding out a word. So that's our poll. There you go.
Thank you, Jeff. So you guys got a lot of the answers correctly, because this is really crucial when you're giving a placement test for levels 1 through 5, is really what is an error while my student's reading to me, because it really can affect their placement if we're counting something that is an error that isn't an error, and vice versa. So you're right. One of the very first things we want to count is if a student is misreading a word, that will be considered an error. Omitting a word, that's an error. And this next one, though, is really important to make note of in your teacher's guide or where you have downloaded the placement test instructions. Reading a word incorrectly and then correctly will be considered an error. So it's a really important one to remember. It's often one that is forgotten. So make sure that you're looking at that in the instructions for each level of the placement test. Now, students can sound out a word, and we often see this, that students sound out a word, but if they never go back and reread that word at a proper or a normal speaking rate, then we would consider that sounding out an error. So really listen for the students. If they are sounding out a word, make sure they went back and reread it at a normal rate. You're absolutely right. Skipping words or a line would be considered an error. And we want to give them about 3 seconds, though, to get a word. And if after about 3 seconds they don't know how to identify the word, go ahead and count the error and give them the word so they can move on. Because really, remember, we're timing them for the entire section that they're reading. If we wait so long for them to figure out a word, they're going to have a very long time on that reading. Then it's going to affect their placement. So go ahead and wait about 3 seconds and then go ahead and give them the word. We're actually going to take a look at a video later of a teacher administering a placement test. So when you're doing a placement test for students in grades 1 through 5, it's very important that you have a copy of the reading passage for every student, that you have a timer, because you're going to time the student from when they begin reading to when they end the passage. So that's really important. And you also need a pencil or a pen so that way you can tally the errors. It's important to make sure that you can see the errors clearly so you can count them after the student has finished reading. Once you gather all the materials that you need, this is what you'll do. You'll go ahead and sit with the student, remember, one-on-one, give them a very brief description of what you would like for them to do, and then time the student reading from the beginning of the passage to the end of the passage, marking their errors as they are reading. It is important at the end of the passage reading that you record their time, because that is going to help you with placement. The placement guidelines has the times in the guidelines, and you want to make sure that you have their accurate time. And then you want to follow the placement guidelines. So we're going to take a look at a teacher giving the 2nd grade placement test. I want you to notice, does she have all the materials needed to give the placement test? Did the teacher give a good description in the beginning? Are they timing the students and really timing them for the entire passage? So I want you to take a look at those things while we watch this video of administering a placement test.
Hi, Katie. I'm going to ask you to do some reading for me today, okay? I would like for you to take a look at this list of words. I'm going to say the word first, and then I'm going to ask you to repeat it, okay? Word 1, expert.
Expert.
Word 2, clinic.
Clinic.
Word 3, interest.
Interest.
Word 4, changes.
Changes.
Word 5, themselves.
Themselves.
Word 6, people.
People.
Word 7, difference.
Difference.
Word 8, mirror.
Mirror.
Word 9, through.
Through.
Word 10, practicing.
Practicing.
Word 11, questions.
Questions.
Good job. Now what I'd like for you to do is read this passage from here all the way to the end as quickly and accurately as you can. Okay? As soon as I say begin. Are you ready? Put your finger on the first word. Begin.
Bill tried to say things that would interest other people. He asked questions and tried to get people to talk about themselves. He said things that were funny. He talked faster and louder. He tried to smile more than he talked. But all those changes made no difference. After Bill was through speaking, everybody else was sleeping. One day, Bill was at home. He was practicing in front of the mirror. He smiled, moved around a lot, and talked to the mirror. Just then the doorbell rang. Bill opened the door and saw a woman who said, I am an expert at making people sleep. I work for the Sleep More Clinic. We help people who have trouble sleeping. I hear that you can make people sleep too. Yes, Bill said. If I speak for a while, people will sleep. That is interesting, the sleep expert said. Can you explain why people sleep? Yes, I can, Bill said.
Nice job reading.
Notice that the teacher is actually put the time that the student finished. So that is very important. She had all the materials ready, the student read the entire passage, and then she actually noted the time that the student had when they were finished reading. We're going to take a look at the second portion of the placement test for levels 1 through 5, which is going to be comprehension questions.
Now what I'd like for you to do is to answer these questions about the passage you just read. Okay? Here's your pencil.
So part 2 of the placement test for levels 1 through 5 are going to have comprehension questions where students will have to answer the questions after they've been timed, and the timed is designated on the sheet. They'll answer the comprehension questions. As you noted in the first video, the teacher did read a list of words to students. That's only going to be on levels 2 and 3. So it's real important to make sure that you're reading the instruction of the placement test level that you're giving, because there are slight variations on the instructions as well as the time allotted for the students to read. The comprehension component is only in levels 2 through 5. Level 1 does not have this component to the placement test. So you'll notice that the placement test procedure will take approximately 5 to 10 minutes to give for students. Now, after you've given the placement test, you're going to use the placement test guideline. But I often have teachers ask me, well, sometimes I have a student who kind of falls in between those guidelines. And this is where these flow charts are going to be a very helpful resource for you that we'll provide to you after this webinar. So here you're looking at an example of a flow chart for grade 1, where on the left-hand side of your screen, this is what is in the placement test guidelines. So you already have that information. But on the right-hand side really gives us other information, especially for students who kind of fall in the middle zone. It'll give you some options on what you could do for students. But sometimes you'll have a student who isn't quite ready for level 1, but doesn't need to start back at the beginning of level K. This would be a prime example where the flow chart will be very helpful. So here you'll see 2 options where you can place the student at level K, lesson 108, so about 2/3 of the program, or you can place them at lesson 1 or lesson 66 of level 1. So it really gives you options, another resource to use if you have a student that's falling in between those guidelines. The flow chart also will give you some suggestions for the older students as well. So as the students get older and if they still have gaps in their reading, sometimes corrective reading might be an appropriate placement for them, and this flow chart gives you a great example of when that would be appropriate for an older student. So in this grade 3 example, we see that we start with the placement test for grade 3, and depending on how the student performs, whether they move to grade 3, the grade 4 placement test, or whether they should actually go ahead and be placed into corrective reading. So these flow charts gives you another resource to use when you're looking at where my students should be placed after they've taken the placement test. So that's pretty important. Once you've given the placement test, you've gathered up all of your data from the placement test, the next thing you're going to do is you're going to form groups. And you're going to form groups based on the data that you've just collected. You're going to form groups by grade, by level, and by lesson. I'm going to show you one way you could do this very easily by using an Excel spreadsheet. And it's pretty great because then you can sort, and when you have that option for the Excel spreadsheet sorting, you really can make sure that students are sorted properly. So here I've opened up an Excel spreadsheet, which you'll also get a copy of at the end of the webinar, so those resources will be available to you. And what you see here on the Excel spreadsheet is that you see my student's name, last name, first name, their grade, and their homeroom teacher. That's really what you want to make sure in the very beginning, that you have it sorted by their grade and homeroom teacher. Now, if you notice in the fourth grade, and I'll scroll down just a little bit so you can actually see, you'll notice in the fourth grade that I have a lot of teachers, but I also have students in a lot of different programs. So if I'm forming groups after they've taken the placement test, then I really need to sort them so that way I know how many are going to be in B1, how many are going to be in Reading Mastery 3, and so on. So you can quickly sort by using the sort and filter. You want to do a custom sort, and I'm just going to actually sort by grade and by placement test. And now what you'll see, which makes it so much easier to see, is all the students that fall into B1 after the placement test has been given, all the students that fall into Decoding B2, and at the very bottom, all the students that fall into Reading Mastery Signature Level 3, and their lesson, their appropriate lesson. Now, because I know that I have a lot of fourth graders and I only have a few in B1, I'm going to assign Miller actually as the B1 teacher. So here where it says DI teacher, I'm going to simply put Miller. And because of time, I'm going to go a little bit quicker on here, but Miller would teach all of the Decoding B1. And then I'm going to go down and say, okay, I have a lot of B2 students. I wonder if I have enough teachers to maybe separate this group into two. And it looks as if I do. So I'm going to go ahead and make Harrington a B2 teacher as well as Johnson. This way I can have this group a little bit smaller. So I'm going to make Harrington also a DI teacher for B2. And I'm going to maybe about halfway, and then I'm going to make Johnson. So here you can see it's easy to sort of get them into their groups with their teachers as well. And then now I have my last group to consider is my Reading Mastery Signature 3. And I have a pretty large group. And so far I have Johnson teaching a group, I have Harrington teaching a group, and then I also have Miller teaching a group. So now I'm going to split this group in half and have O'Brien teach half, and then have Smith teach the other half. And all I need to do is copy and paste the teacher and have this complete chart filled out. And I have it organized very, very quickly about how many students are in each group, who's teaching the group, and now my fourth grade is completely sorted. So it's really an easy way to take your placement test data, put it on this Excel spreadsheet, which you'll get a copy of, and then sort very quickly and get your groups up and running as soon as possible. So it's important to make sure that you have that information first before you do this. And you need the placement test data, and you need your student's name and their homeroom teacher. So we often have implementations, I know we have some here in the webinar, that are in year 2 or further in their Reading Mastery Signature. And you're probably asking, well, my students aren't taking the placement test this year. What do I do for my students who had the program last year? Very good question. You can use your end-of-year data to actually place students into the program. So remember, at the end of the year, you looked at your students and you know where they were, you know where they left off. You just use where you recommended they should start the school year. You use that information, and then you can form your groups that way. So using that end-of-year data for students who have been in the program already is great for placement as well. So I want to do just a quick overview of what we've just done. We've done a lot in the last 25 or so minutes about placement tests. But one thing I hope you realize how critical placement test is for success, not just for the students, but also for the success of the implementation. We want everyone to be successful. Students excelling, teachers excelling in teaching, so that way you can see a really great reading growth for your students. You want to make sure that you have every piece of material already ready for you, prepared, set up, so that way you can use and maximize those minutes. Make sure you're following the guidelines for each placement test, because each level has a variation. Level K being the most different, but levels 1 through 5 really looking at the time limit for the reading passage, looking at the error limit, looking at do they have to do comprehension questions and a word list or just comprehension. Those slight variations, you want to make sure that you are reading the instructions and following the placement test guidelines. If you're in year 2 or more, use your end-of-year data for placement, and then form your groups as quickly as possible. Once you've gathered all of your placement data, you can form your groups, and that way your students can begin their road to success with Reading Mastery Signature Edition. I think we do have a couple minutes maybe for some questions before we close out. Are there any questions that we had? I know you had the ability to type them in throughout today's webinar.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kia. Mary, do we have any questions out there?
Yep, we have a few, and please feel free to type them into the question area or the chat box for us, and we'll try and get to as many as we can before the end of the webinar. So Kia, the first question was, can you have school personnel other than teachers administer the placement tests?
Well, this is a great question. I'm glad this was asked. And as long as they've been trained on that placement test, I would say this is a great resource to use more adults in your building, because if you're placement testing a large number of students. So as long as they've been trained, if they're not a teacher, if they're an instructional coach, or they are one of your best paraprofessionals, if they've been trained in the placement test, yes, they can give the placement test to students.
Okay. The second question was for kindergarten. When you're testing all of kindergarten coming in, can you give the level 1 test to students who already know how to read?
Well, I think you probably know your students best if you have information on them. Yes, because the placement test guidelines, if it becomes too difficult, which level 1, they read a passage at a time, using the flow chart, it'll let you know what you could do for those students, especially if they're kindergarten, they're already reading. It's a chance that they may be able to place in that lesson 108 in kindergarten, or you may have some advanced kindergartners that could place in level 1. But know your students first. I wouldn't say that is the rule for every kindergartner, but if you have some information about this kindergartner or they have reading ability, then yes, that would be appropriate.
Okay. All right, we have another question.
Okay.
They're asking to elaborate a little bit more on using the end of the year data for placements.
Okay.
You can also reference the webinar too that you did last year. Go ahead.
Okay, so I did refer to if you are in year 2 or more to use your end of year data. Last year we did a series on how to close out the year, and one of the things we talked a lot about is making sure we knew where students ended last year and where we thought they may start next year. So what you could do is use that column or use your information on where you thought they will begin this year as your placement test data. For an example, if you had a group of 3rd graders and they finished in the middle of 3rd grade last year, and this year they're going to start reading mastery signature, let's just say at lesson 53, then they would begin that at that point using the data from last year. Same thing for your 1st graders. If they finished first kindergartner at 100%, they were at mastery, and you said, yes, they're going to begin lesson 1, then you would use that information to go ahead and begin them at lesson 1. So take a look at where they left off last year and what you projected they would be at the beginning of the year. Use that data as the placement test data. And if you want to look at that webinar series on how to close out the year in that Excel spreadsheet, we do have that recorded, and I'll make sure that you know how to locate that before we leave today's webinar.
Great. And then we had another one. I was just verifying with her the question. She was asking about Reading Mastery Plus in terms of the flow chart. And we will go ahead and check and see if we have the Plus K through 2 flow chart available to send to her, but the information for 3 and above would apply for the same information. The question was about Plus versus signature.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. That's good information. I want to just say thank you, and we're excited about having another series of webinars with you throughout the year. But please find us on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube. We have a YouTube McGraw-Hill Education channel, but we also have a direct instruction playlist with lots of wealth of information and resources. The webinar series from last year, the webinar series for this year will be on there. So go ahead and visit that playlist, that direct instruction playlist, to find some information that might be useful to you for this incoming school year. Also, if you're interested, we're having an intervention virtual professional learning conference next month. It's going to be a wonderful experience to have such great experts join us for this virtual conference. You can register at mheonline.com/2015intervention. The registration is easy, and you'll get a chance to really listen to some experts in the field of intervention. Jeff, if you want, I think I finished. I just wanted to say thank you. Did you have anything else you wanted to add today?
Thank you so much, Kia. Great job. I do want to thank again, on behalf of everyone, thank you so much for joining us for this first webinar of the year. We're so excited you're able to join us, and we do hope to see you in the future webinars. October 14th is our next webinar. Same time, we're going to focus on teaching techniques in the teacher-student game, because that's something that comes up a lot. But please, if you still have questions, please continue to type them in. We hope to, again, see you at the webinar. We also have that virtual conference. Even if you can't attend, if you register, you can get links to view the recorded sessions from Jan Hasbrook and Mark Shin and other wonderful presenters, including Kia. So again, thank you so much. The last thing I want to ask you all is when you leave, please take a moment and give us some feedback. There's a quick survey. It'll only take you a couple minutes, but we do want to get your feedback to make sure we're telling you the information that you really want to hear, that it'll help you with your implementation. And in about 24 hours, you will also receive a follow-up email that will give you the link to watch the recording, to download the handouts, and anything else. And if you need anything else, please feel free to email me, Jeff Omer. I'm the person that you got the response from for the webinar today. And with that, we'll say thank you so much and have a great school year, and we will see you next month. Thank you.